Hello and welcome to Adobe XD Class 1, which is going to focus mostly on the Design tab of Adobe XD. We're going to keep this relatively brief because we want to just run through the things that you might not already know about Adobe XD, though if you were in attendance to the class on Tuesday, you'd probably already know a lot of this stuff. This is going to be a useful tool in case you ever want to run back over this video. If you ever get confused about the way something works in Adobe XD, you can always refer back to this. And so yeah, the second video in the series is going to be focusing on the prototyping side of Adobe XD. But for now, we're just going to look at the Design tab. So let's jump in, switch my screen up here. Okay, so first things to remember, and we always run over this when we talk about Adobe XD. I know it's tired of hearing about it, but Adobe XD doesn't work the same way as other Adobe programs. That's because Adobe XD is quite new. So it's only been around for 6 or 7 years at this point, maybe a little longer, I'm not sure. But most Adobe programs are way older than that, like 20 years plus. So people have been using other Adobe programs for a long time and it can sort of feel set in their ways. Adobe XD doesn't work in the same sort of way. So one thing you can't do is you can't tear panels, which is to say you can't pull any of these panels off and make them floating windows in Adobe XD. Everything is sort of stuck where it is, which can be really good if we're doing something like this kind of tutorial where you need to be able to see where things are relative to where they are on my screen. A couple of quick things to run over. So the top right up here, you have the zoom control. And if you look in the view panel, you can get some keyboard shortcuts for different zoom levels. So you have zoom in and out, of course. You have 100%, 200%, zoom to selection, zoom to fit all. And yeah, pretty easy to jump in and out of different zoom levels with that. Of course, you can also use the little percentage at the top right, and that would give you the ability to control it more finely. We're going to talk a little bit about the tools over on the left-hand side. So we have the Select tool, which works the way you would expect it should work in many other Adobe programs. You can use it to click and drag and select things. You can click individual items to select them directly. In Adobe XD, one thing that's quite interesting is that it operates in a double click to drop down a hierarchy sort of method. So if I click on this little globe and I double click on the globe part, I'll enter into the object. When I double click again, it'll select the group that is the globe. When I double click again, it will focus on just one of the paths in the globe, which is this background here. So each time you double click, you go one deeper into whatever selection you're hovering over. Now we can back out of this by hitting the escape key as many times as we had double clicked to get into that hierarchy. So each time you hit the escape key, you'll jump back out one level. So that's useful to know as well. If you are looking at the Adobe XD sort of overview, you have a blank canvas, you can press the A key on your keyboard to bring up the Artboard tool. When you press the Artboard tool, which you can see over on the left-hand side here, you'll get a list of Artboard standard sizes. So you can choose from this list, so you can have a template starting off that works with whatever format you're trying to design for. You can see here we have some social media categories, so Instagram stories or posts, Twitter posts, headers, things like that. We also have up here different mobile phone sizes, tablet sizes, web and desktop sizes over on the right-hand side. So if we're making a desktop website, it would be really easy to click on the 1920 by 1080 button, and we would have a 1920 by 1080 frame for our web design when we're getting started. So that makes things really easy, really quick to make new artboards. If we're looking at some more of the tools over on this left-hand side, we have the rectangle tool, which you should be familiar with. You can create squares and rectangles with that. You have the circle tool, the ellipse tool that you can create lots of circular-based shapes with. And we have the polygon tool, which has a unique feature in that if you're holding down and clicking and dragging to make a shape, you can push up or down on your keyboard, and it will increase or decrease the number of sides that it has. I've shown this off already, but when you select one of your polygons that you've created with the polygon tool, and in the sort of selection menu over here on the right, if instead of 3 we put less than 3 and hit enter, it turns into a nice little heart, which is super fun, super cute. So we'll undo that. You have a line segment tool, which works just like the line segment tool in most other Adobe programs. You can draw simple lines with those. And you also have the pen tool, which is just as powerful for the most part as you would find in Adobe Illustrator. So you should be quite familiar with the way that works as well. Of course, we have a type tool, so we can open up text boxes and type things in here. It gives you some control over on the right-hand side, but not an unlimited amount of control. It doesn't have certain things like character styles, paragraph styles as a menu built in, but that's okay. We can sort of find other ways to work around those things a little bit later using our library panel over on the left side, which we will run through as well. So, one thing in Adobe XD that's interesting to know is that if you have a shape that's drawn with simple lines, like this one here, this is just a rectangle, and we have a couple of little line prongs here. If I scale this, the strokes and effects scale totally differently than you might expect. It's like in Illustrator, if you don't have these scale, strokes, and effects selected, you'll get a result like this. So one thing we can do to mitigate this is we could either take this file, copy it from Adobe XD with a Control-C or Command-C, go into Illustrator and paste it in, and then make changes to it there. Or we can go into the Object menu up at the top here, and we can actually go to Path and Outline Stroke. And if we outline the stroke of this path, we can see now we can scale it proportionally. And that's because when we do this, you're actually creating a fill inside of each of these lines. It is just outlining the strokes and creating fill areas rather than leaving them as lines. So obviously, if you do convert the object like that, you'll no longer be able to go in and change things like line widths as easily because you're changing it to a different type of object. One thing that's really good to know, now that we're looking at this object here, if you look over on your left-hand side of your screen, you'll see we have a number of vector shapes that make up this object. Now, every time you create a shape in Adobe XD, it's going to give it a name. And the name is typically something crazy like this. So this is called Rectangle 137424. That's not a great name to remember exactly what you're working with. So I'd always recommend in Adobe XD, you go in and you rename your important objects so you know exactly what they are and what they're useful for. Without making changes to this, it would be quite difficult to tell what part of what shape you are grabbing onto. This becomes even more important when you're doing web design because each section of your site should be labeled appropriately so you know where to find different objects in the flow as you start working. Let's briefly chat about components, about your library panel, and about character styles and colors. So on the left-hand side of the screen here in Adobe XD, you can see we have a number of drop-down categories. This is part of your library panel, which can be found if you look at the bottom of the screen on the bottom left, right here. It's right above the Layers panel and the Plugins panel, which we won't be talking too explicitly about right now. So when we look here at the library panel, or the assets panel as sometimes it's called, you'll see we have a number of sections. We have missing fonts. I don't have them installed. We have colors, character styles, and components. Components we'll talk about a little bit later, but for right now we're going to focus on colors. So I don't have any colors listed in my document, but I've done a little bit of exploration here, and I have a list of colors here that I think I want to have included in my library panel so that I can re-access them anytime. The way to do that is to grab your entire artboard and simply click the Add Color from Selection tool. If I do that, it will add every color that I had selected on the entire artboard. So any color represented on this artboard has now been added to my libraries panel, which is very quick, very powerful. Of course, if I wanted to, I could also click an individual color and I could have that added as well. But honestly, why would you spend the time if you could make it work a lot quicker? You'll notice that also if I select a color that's already added, it won't give me the option to add it again, which is a very nice touch. Love that. Same thing works with character styles. If I go down here and I remove all of my character styles, I can find my panel down here where I have all of my character styles I've laid out and designed, And this is something that I do sometimes when I'm planning on doing a big design development. I do what's called a design language. So I determine, what does my header look like? What do my body copies look like? What does header 2, 3, 4, all the way down, 2 sizes of paragraphs, and you really dig into it. Now, if I select the artboard here, I could do the exact same thing. I can hit the plus button next to character styles, and it will give me everything into my library panel. Again, of course, you can select individual items and have them added, and you can also change your library panel view to a grid view, which can give you a little more of a robust look at all of your colors, your type choices, and your components you have saved. Very handy. So in terms of things that Adobe XD does very similarly to other Adobe programs, you can see here we have the standard Boolean operations, and that is a little subsection located on the top right of your menu up here. You'll see you have your add, you have subtract, you have intersect, and you have exclude overlap. For the most part, these work exactly the same way they would work in something like Illustrator. One of the big differences is that you can actually come in here, double click, and change the shape in relation to each other if you'd like to. So you can, once you've added something, actually go in and make changes to it, which is pretty useful if you want to make a shape that's a little bit flexible. You're not sure if you have something that's final yet, you want to make a couple of adjustments to it. You can jump back in. It's a non-destructive process, unlike most of the time when you're making these kinds of Boolean operations in something like Adobe Illustrator. So let's talk about working with different file formats. One thing you can do very easily in Adobe XD is you can open any other Adobe file, say Illustrator or Photoshop in our case, from the File menu at the top of the screen. So under the File menu, if you choose Open from your computer, you'll get an option to open up any other file type you want. So here I'm going to open up an Illustrator illustrations file. When I open this up, you'll see it loads, takes just a second to load in, but then once it loads in, I'm getting all of my Illustrator artboards just laid out in Adobe XD. This is really useful because I can come in here and I can copy all of these things, go to my other artboard, and I can simply paste them in. Now I have the Adobe Illustrator file working here in my Adobe XD file. Very quick and very easy. You can, of course, copy and paste from Illustrator into XD, and you could also copy from XD back into Illustrator and then back into Adobe XD, which is what we'd call round tripping. This is useful in case you need to make adjustments, more finite adjustments to vector objects, or if you're just plain old more familiar with using Illustrator and you don't want to do so much vector rigging in something like Adobe XD. Another type of file that we would often open in something like this, I'm going to open from my computer again, and I'm going to select Photoshop. I can open up a Photoshop file just the same way. You'd want to make sure that before you import this, all of your layers make sense, all of your file is all set up the way it should be, because Adobe XD, again, will just open these things up the same way. So if I look at what's over here on my left-hand panel, I have a lot of items that are just called ellipses 1 copy, rectangle 3, normal state, things like that. You'd probably want to have a better naming convention before you bring anything else into Adobe XD. Okay, so that covers off basically how we can bring things into Adobe XD from other programs. Let's take a look at how images and masking work from Photoshop. So in Adobe XD, sick of me hearing that yet? I'm going to say that a lot. Whenever you bring an image in, it'll automatically provide a mask for the image. So in this case, we brought this image in and I've pre-masked it to cover up part of the image. To access and see the image in its mask, I can double click on the image itself and it will give me the crop frame. So this is very much like cropping an image, but again, it's non-destructive. So if I come in here and select this image and copy it, I can then take it to another object and I can paste appearance, and that will paste the object into another frame. We can do the same thing here with the word mask, but before we do that, we'll have to outline the text. You can't paste inside of text that hasn't been outlined. So I'll go Object, Path, Convert to Path, and then I can paste appearance in here. Same thing goes for these two objects. I can also paste appearance into those. So it's pretty flexible what you can actually paste imagery into. Very cool, works very well. Let's talk about blending modes. So with blending modes, they work very similarly to the way you'd expect in other Adobe programs. Again, you can go darken, you can multiply, you can do a color burn or an overlay. In this case, let's do overlay. You can do color dodge, anything you want. You can play with these overlays and see which one suits your image you're using. Keep in mind that anything you see here on the Adobe XD side panel, as far as image manipulation tools, so blend modes, things like that, those are all applicable inside of the web browser as well. So the idea with Adobe XD is to make all of these things as relevant to the web as possible. So if you can do it in XD, presumably you should be able to do it on the web as well. They keep some of the tools limited specifically for that reason. They don't want you to go totally wild and crazy. They want you to be constrained by what can happen on the web or with an app development. As you should well know by now, one thing I consider very essential in the web design process is creating grids and guides to make sure that you're laying things out the way they should be in relation to each other. So in Adobe XD, this is no different. Although to access your grids and guides in Adobe XD, what you want to do is you want to click on the name of your artboard first. That gives you control over the entire artboard as it stands now. Once you've done that, you can look over in your right-hand panel, right above my head in the video right here, right there. You can see it says grid, and you can just click this checkbox, and it'll show you how your grid is set up currently. This artboard right now I have set up on a 12 column grid. I have 20 pixel gutter and I have an 87 pixel column width. I can go in here and I can change these values, and you can see them change on the artboard itself. It's only changing on the artboard that I have selected currently. If you would rather, you can also use a square grid, which is a more traditional grid paper style design tool, but we usually use column grids here. They're a little easier to manage as far as being able to line things up in a vertical, horizontal alignment sort of thing. Okay, let's talk about text. So when you're using text in Adobe XD, one thing you'll probably notice is that your text starts in a box setting over here called fixed size. You can find that in your text panel on the right-hand side when you select a text box. When text is a fixed size, what that means is if you squash this box down, you'll get an overflow warning, a little red dot at the bottom of your frame telling you that there's more text that you can't see. Just like in InDesign, if you double click this, it'll expand the button itself, or expand the box rather, and you'll be able to see all of the text. Now, if what you're looking for is to have text that's controlled using an automatic width setting, you can change that over here on the box menu. You see it right above here. You change that to auto width. Once you change it to auto width, you'll only get one handle. That handle is just going to make your text larger or smaller depending on where you drag it. So it's really limiting in the way you can control it, but if you're doing something like a header and you wanted it to automatically always fit the same width in a responsive sort of design, this could be quite useful. When we talk about auto height, that's the second setting over here. Auto height gives you 4 options to grab here, the handles in the left, right, top, and bottom. But with auto height, when you squash down the box, it will automatically reflow the text to fit inside of whatever size box you have here, which can be quite useful for, again, responsive, dramatic, different design layouts. Here, this is again just a fixed size box, so it will cut off once we squash those things down. Really, that's the majority of what you would need to know to work with text in Adobe XD. If you see I select one of these boxes here, on the right-hand side, you have pretty similar sort of layouts for the way that things work in text world. So we have the font, we have the size, the weight, and we have some of the controls here, character spacing, line spacing, and paragraph spacing. Pretty limited as far as the actual controls go, but I think you can get a lot done with very little in something like Adobe XD. Okay, so now it's time to talk a little bit about working with scrolling and working with 3D transforms. So we're going to start with scrolling. As you can see here, and you may remember from class, we have a selection of T's here that are set up in sort of a carousel-y kind of way. I'm going to preview this artboard by selecting the artboard and pressing the play button up here to see what it looks like. And shamefully, my little gallery doesn't work. So we're going to make it work right now. Here's how you make a horizontal scroll in Adobe XD. You would take each one of these items and you would select them, and usually before you do anything else, you would group them by hitting Command and G. That groups them together. Now, once you have them selected, we can choose to set them up with a scroll type. Over here, right above my head, see that little floating thing? These are the 3 scroll types. We have horizontal scroll, we have vertical scroll, and we have horizontal and vertical scroll. So for something like this, something like a carousel of images, we would use horizontal scroll. When we select horizontal scroll, we'll get handles on the left and right sides of our little gallery. I'm going to squash these down and make just a little clipping mask sort of thing with them by pulling both handles in on the left and right. Once I've pulled those in and I preview my page again, you'll see we have a very natural looking working carousel. Very easy. Now, to talk about the way that we can use a horizontal and vertical scroll, I'm going to use this map. So by selecting the map, I'll have the option up here to select horizontal and vertical scroll. Once I do, you'll see that my map is now bound on all corners with the same kinds of handles. When I select this and I preview it and I scroll down, you'll see I can grab and scroll through any part of this map now. Very convenient. So a horizontal and vertical scroll means you can sort of scroll any direction. A horizontal scroll, of course, means you can only scroll left and right. And a vertical scroll is what we typically see when you're viewing a web page, which is you can scroll up and down the page itself. Now let's take a look at 3D transforming objects. So for this, we're going to be using the same carousel design, but we're going to be adding a little bit of flair. When I select these items, I can choose to change them in the transform panel. Again, right above me here, you see this little box, this 3D box, it says 3D transforms, and it'll give you the hotkey for it as well, which on a Mac should be Command+T. So I'll click this button and it will make all of my objects 3D. Now, when I select an object now, I'll have what's called a gizmo. The gizmo appears on the center of my object, and it will allow me to grab either on the horizontal spin, the vertical spin, or the front and back sort of alignment for my 3D object. Watch this. I'll grab my horizontal spin and I'll turn it just slightly. And I'll do the same thing here and the same thing here. And we're just rotating these cards. Now I can take these cards and I can start to stack them. But what we'll see is a stack order doesn't really seem to make sense. And the reason for that is because our stack order is controlled by our Z index. We can control that by clicking on the center of our gizmo and pushing it forward or backwards. And when we do that, we'll be able to control the order that each one of these items appears in on the actual screen. We'll select all of these, bring them over to the center, and now we have a nice little gallery view for our T's. Very neat. So now we'll review alignment very quickly. Alignment, we're not going to do too much in depth on because it does work the same way as it does in all other Adobe tools. And you know that I've really been talking about alignment and grids and things quite a lot because they're very important in web design to have everything lined up. But when you select a variety of items, you will get your standard controls up at the very top of the screen. You can see it way up there. Align top, align center, and then your different spacing tools, distributing horizontally and such. So we will just center align all of these items, and we can choose to have them all centered perfectly and separated perfectly from each other. That will give you a perfect layout every time. Now, when I grab an item and I move it in Adobe XD, you'll see that it gives me a series of pink squares that show me the distance between objects. This is useful because when we move things around, we can, at a glance, get a very good idea of how far everything is from each other and what's lining up and what's not. So we can see here, these two objects really line up now, and then I can have these two objects line up with that. And again, now all of these objects should be perfectly aligned. Adobe XD will give you a lot of feedback as you move items around to try to tell you where things are in relation to other objects on the artboard. You should keep these things in mind when you're using Adobe XD to make sure all of your items are always aligned as you expect they should be. Now we're going to talk about Repeat Grid with Adobe XD, which is one of the most powerful tools that Adobe XD has at its disposal for saving you time. So this you should definitely pay attention to. When we select an item, such as this Amazon Medley Tee, we can create what's called a repeat grid. If you look above where this little widget is popping out, you can click on the Repeat Grid button or use the key command. For Macs, I believe it would be Command R, and you can create a repeat grid. Notice what happens to our object on the screen when we push this button. The outline changes to green and we get two handles. The reason for these two handles is because you can grab one of the handles and start pulling in a direction, and you'll start to get a change on your artboard. Watch this. Whoa, we're duplicating the items that are inside of this little box. So we can also do that on the vertical, and now we have 6 total items in our repeat grid. Now, no example of repeat grid would be complete unless we showed you the easiest way to fill content in the world. I'm just going to open up an asset folder I have here. So as you can see here, we have, say, 6 varieties of tea, images listed here. From your folder, you can simply grab one of these bundles of images. I'm grabbing tea 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and you can drag it right into Adobe XD on top of a photo. When you do, Adobe XD is smart enough to actually replace every image in your repeat grid with one of the images from the bundle you grabbed. I have some text files here as well, and the text files really just contain, if you can see here, one name on each line for my teas. These are my product titles. I can go in and I can grab one of these product title TXT files and drop it onto the product titles on my list. When I do that, each one of these product titles change based on each line that I had in that text file. The same thing applies for product prices. The same thing applies for product descriptions, and the same thing can apply to any amount of text you want to drag and drop into a repeat grid. Now, once you're finished with your repeat grid and you don't want to make any more changes to it, you can ungroup the grid. But before you do, you'll probably want to know that when you move into the middle sections of your grid, you have control over your gutter spaces between the objects. Just by clicking and dragging on these pink spaces, you can control the width of distance between the objects. Very handy. When you ungroup the grid, it basically becomes a standard set of objects as though it was never a grid to begin with, which means that it's indistinguishable from a regular series of laid out little cards in this case. Very powerful stuff. We are now going to talk about padding as it relates to at least buttons. Padding can be used on any number of objects, but buttons are a really common use of padding. So, as you see here, if I drag and copy this button a couple of times, if I start typing in a lot more text than you'd expect in a button, you'll see that it doesn't change the size of the button. It doesn't flow properly. The text just sits outside the button, and while I certainly could grab the button and start stretching it out and making it fit, that's not the easiest way to do something like this. I'm going to show you a better way. What I would do is I would grab this button, I'm going to duplicate it again. Now I'm going to take this button, and you have to select both the button and the text in the same grab, and you can change over here. You can see it right above me here. See that enable disable padding button? You can click that and it will give you options for padding. So when you first click the button, it will tell you what the padding is in relation to the item on the inside and the item that operates as the background. In this case, our background is this red layer, and on the foreground is our text layer. So on above and below my text layer, I have 10 pixels of padding. You can see here and here. And on the left and right, I have 47. I'm going to knock these numbers down a little bit to 30 and 30, and I think that's a pretty good look for my button. Now when I copy this button and I start typing too much text for a button, all of a sudden you can see that the padding is automatically adjusting as we go to make sure that space is filled correctly. Very powerful tool, padding. Let's talk about the use of responsive resize in Adobe XD. So we're first going to take this tablet size, and it's only here as reference, and I'm going to take this 761 pixels width that I know it has and copy it. I'm going to delete this tablet artboard because we're not actually trying to build a whole new site in a tablet format. We're trying to be really lazy here, and we're trying to resize from our mobile size to our tablet size. So I'll copy this artboard and I'll make a duplicate copy of it. So the first thing we'll want to do is click on the responsive resize button. That's going to make sure that anytime we make a change to any of this, the actual size will adjust as we're working with it. And I'm going to change the width of this to a 761, which is the width we grabbed from our tablet size, and hit enter. Aha! So a couple of things went pretty well and a couple of things went a little bit wild. So we can see for the most part, the site has become centered in the page, which is quite nice. It worked pretty well as a quick turnaround mobile to tablet resize. But we can see our T icon up here and our leaf icon down here are kind of sitting too far over to the left, and our image isn't really tied in correctly. Let's take a look at why that might have happened with a little undo. So if we look at the icon for the T here, on the side over here, we can see that it says it's manually responsive resizing. So responsive resize is checked, but it's trying to do so manually rather than do it automatically. I'm just going to change this to automatic. I'm going to do the same thing with the T image below, and I'm going to give this a shot. I'm going to try and resize this again with my 761. Aha, there we go. Now my icons have automatically resized themselves into the center. When you have things like this selected and you're automatically resizing them or manually trying to resize them, clicking on any one of these anchor points will anchor it to the left, right, top, or bottom, depending on which one you choose. So by choosing auto, you're letting Adobe XD decide which one will work best for your page. Now with just a couple of tweaks, including just jumping in here and moving the image over, the site is pretty well ready to go on tablet. Very quick and easy when you're working with tools like this. Now we get to talk about components and instances. So a component is really just any object on your artboard that you plan on reusing somewhere else, and so you turn it into a component. You would take something like a button, as you can see here. You could take this button and right-click on it and make component, the key command being Command K. Once a button or something else on your artboard, it could really be anything, is a component, you'll see that it has a changed outline. Now the outline is green, where on my previous button, the outline was blue. On this green outline in the top left corner, you can also see that there's a little green solid diamond. That is an indicator that this is your prime component. This is the main component that you have created. All changes you make to this component will affect change across every other component of its subtype. So when I take this button and I duplicate it a couple of times, you'll see I have now 3 instances of this original component. When I change the text in here, you can see that it's changed the text across all of my components. Likewise, when I change the size of certain things, it's reflected on all of the subcomponents. Now, if I were to take one of the subcomponents and make a change this again, you'll see it doesn't reflect onto the other components. And when I selected this component here, that green diamond has a little dot in it. That's to say, hey, this is an item that was a component, and now you've created a different version of it. So I'm letting you know I'm unique. If we take this component, we could always revert it back to its main state. If we do that, it will drop right back to the way it was when it was originally conceived. Very simple stuff. Now, components do work in a way like a CSS or a cascading style sheet. So if you make a change to one of the smaller subsection components, any of the components that aren't the main component. Say I make a color change here. I'm going to select the background color and I'm going to change it to this color. Now when I change my component master copy background color to say black, the component that already had a color change won't change color with the rest of the child components. And the reason for that is the child component will look to say, did you make a specific modification to me? Because if you did, I'm not going to be overridden by the change you make to the master component anymore. I'm going to wait until you take a look and override me manually. This is so you can create variants from a single component and make sure that your changes aren't overridden. Now, because I haven't changed the text in this field, if I do change the text here, you can see it still changes the text, even though I've changed the color of that one component. So it will only not override the changes that you've made specifically to the child component. Now we're going to chat a little bit about component states. So component states are very powerful, and they're mostly used for things like hover states, click states, things like that in actual interactivity. But here's a really clever way you can use a component state. Let's say I have a spot I know I want to repeat, and I want to have an icon in there that's interchangeable depending on certain situations. I'll take this box, pretend it's my icon frame. I'm going to make this box a component. So I'm going to make a component out of my box. Once this box has been componentized, I'll have a control up here, which is called component main, and you'll see it says default state up at the top. It should be right above me here. If I click new state here, don't want to click hover state or toggle state, I'll click new state. I'm going to call it green tea. Now, when I have this state selected, any changes I make to my component will be changes that are reflected in just this state. So I'm going to grab my green tea icon here, I'm going to copy it, I'm going to select my component, and I'm going to paste into the component and move this green tea into that space. So now if I select my component, I can change to the default state, nothing, and I can change to the green tea state, which has green tea in it. I can create another new state. I'm going to call this matcha roll. Sorry, my spelling was atrocious there for a moment. So I have a new state now called matcha roll. I'll grab this little matcha roll here, and I will click into this state. I will delete this image, and I will paste into my component my matcha roll. There we go. Now when I select my component, I have three states. I have a default state which has nothing in it, I have a green tea state which has a green tea in it, and I have a matcha roll which has a nice little pastry in it. So anywhere I use this component now, it will have three states that I can activate as I need to show whatever icon I need in whatever spot. If you think outside the box, you can think of lots of ways that you could use this to swap in assets instead of manually placing them every time. That's it. We've come to the end of the first class on Adobe XD. This is obviously not every single thing we covered in the actual class. We don't have 3 hours to sit down and run through this stuff in a video again, but I hope that what I've included in this video gives you enough to start working with Adobe XD and gives you better ideas about what kind of questions you have about what you need to know to solve a problem you might run into while you're working in Adobe XD. We've only covered the design tab so far, so hold on for the next video when we talk about prototyping, where we'll start talking about how to make things move, how to change hover states, things like that. That's where the exciting stuff starts, so get ready for the next video. I'll see you there.